So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Katarina Åsbrink. I'm head of the Department for Promotion and Communication here at the Swedish Embassy. Heartfelt welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for defying the ice and the cold and the strike. Of course, this cold is nothing compared to Kiev this night, but this outcome, this turnout tonight really shows the great interest of the topic and how we can increase the cost of the Russian aggression. I want to welcome our viewers online because the turnout here was so wonderful that we also are streaming this event on our YouTube channel. Heartfelt welcome as well. And I want to have a special welcome to our Ukrainian participants online. Ласкаво просимо до Фелесhuset, дорогі українські європейські браті та сестри. Ми з вами до перемоги і після. This event tonight is a joint effort. It's a holy trinity of not just the Swedish Embassy, but a wonderful cooperation together with the Kiel Institute and the Brookings Institution. And I believe I really want to express my profound gratitude to all the colleagues. You will be properly introduced on stage, but I also want to mention Robin Brooks from Brookings Institution and Elisabeth Schröder. We had a wonderful cooperation. I think it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship, ménage à trois almost, it's a topic that's going to be with us for some time. So here we are today, sanctions. Sanctions, do they work? Are they efficient? Are they enforced? Are they being evaded? Do they harm us? Complex. A lot of questions, a lot of information, misinformation, disinformation. And in order to discuss that, we have two distinguished panels. The first panels are experts. You're going to be introduced properly also in a second. We're going to get the facts right. The facts, there are facts. And we're extremely happy that we have one Jim Tankersley from the New York Times to moderate that panel. Jim, you are the bureau chief here in Berlin, covering a lot of issues, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and you've been reporting on economic issues for a long time. I hear that Jim is recognized for his ability to explain very complex economic issues so people understand them. And our researchers, they have been put up with a mission impossible, not to come here with a lot of slides, so they got the request was one killer slide. So let's see if they are going to deliver on that one. The second panel is going to be to look far ahead and see how we're going to sharpen the policies. What can we do to increase the cost for Russia of this horrific aggression? And for that, we have distinguished policy members who are going to be properly introduced. And we have one, Polina Ivanova. Thank you so much. Foreign correspondent at the Financial Times. You've been covering Russia, Ukraine, CIS countries, Kremlin policies, etc. And because of your fearless reporting, you were also shortlisted a couple of years ago for the George Orwell Prize for Political Reporting. So after these two sessions, you're all going to be so full of food for thoughts. So we thought that we're going to provide you with some food for stomach as well. So please, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions, short Q&A answers after each panel. But then afterwards, warmly welcome upstairs to our reception and to continue the discussion over a couple of drinks. But now I'd like to kick off this event and give the floor to Ambassador Veronika Wand-Danielsson.
As Katarina said, wow, it's winter skiing holiday, forgot to mention, and they chose to come here. Perfect. Excellencies, dear guests, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, kära nordiska vänner eller svenska vänner som är här ikväll. Welcome, as Katarina said, to our Felleshus, the common space for dialogue and events of the 5 Nordic embassies in Berlin. I am both honored, but not the least am I particularly pleased to host today's discussion together with the Brookings Institutions and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. A warm thank you to both institutions for this important and actually most timely event. I, in fact, started off this morning with already a breakfast session with our EU colleagues in Berlin under the new Cyprus presidency, and with Ukraine as the main theme, and in presence of the Ukrainian ambassador in Berlin, Oleksiy Makeyev. And one of the key issues we discussed this morning already was in fact the importance of sanctions, additional sanctions on Russia. We are therefore very grateful that also Ukrainian friends are joining in these conversations, will come with key questions later on, despite everything they are enduring. This morning again, as Oleksiy said, Russia carried out a massive ballistic missile attack, including more than 300 drones against Kiev and Kharkiv. Families are entering their third week without dependable electricity, heat or water, and enduring around temperatures around minus 20 degrees Celsius. And soon, into the 5th year of its war of aggression, Russia is even intensifying its brutal campaign of terror against Ukrainian civilians. And we see no signs that Putin is willing to negotiate a fair peace. But we know that Ukraine is prepared to try, and God knows they are trying. What we also know is what Ukraine needs: more money and more weapons. Last year, the Nordic countries, with all our together 28 million citizens in the 5 countries, all of them, yes, my country and Finland as well these days, NATO members, stood for a third of the 32 NATO allies' total military support to Ukraine. As the Germans would say, da ist Luft nach oben. Much more can, much more should, much more needs to be done by the remaining NATO members as well. And how do we know this? How do we know these figures? We know it thanks to the excellent work and the team behind the Kiel Institute's Ukraine Support Tracker. Thank you to the Kiel Institute for that important work, which we capitals need. As our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Maria Malmer Stenergard, underlines, the cost of our support must be measured against the consequences of not helping Ukraine. And at the same time, we know pressure on Russia must increase. Sweden, therefore, together with Finland, has presented 3 proposals for the EU's 20th sanctions package. 1, we want to see that a total ban on all European companies offering any services of ships carrying Russian oil, gas, and coal. No shipments, no insurance, no repairs in ports. The second proposal, we want to see measures against Russian fertilizers, still the 3rd largest Russian export to the EU, still today. And third, we want to put a stop to the export of luxury goods from the EU to Russia. A country should not be able to violate European values and still have access to exclusive European products. Despite 19 rounds of sanctions, there is still much more to do to increase pressure on Russia. And this can only be achieved together among Europeans, with our allies across the Atlantic, and of course with partners all around the world. We have this evening assembled some of the best minds worldwide. I said some. As well as 3 representatives from Ukraine, Germany, and Swedish representatives to discuss how we can do more to assist Ukraine and to be tougher on Russia. I now will hand over to Mr. Moritz Schularick from the Kiel Institute for a few words before Tim Jakashli from the New York Times gets the expert discussion going. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to a good and thought-provoking evening. Slava Ukraini.
Well, thank you so much, dear Ambassador Wand-Danielsson. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, very happy to see such a full house here today at the Nordic embassies. I also Can't say enough on behalf of the Kiel Institute, the president, Moritz Schularick, how happy we are about this cooperation, how well it went, and I look forward to a very timely and important evening. Let me, because you've done it so nicely at the beginning, Katharina, let me thank you to Katharina Asbrink, Mats Karlsson, and Pierre Ströller from the Swedish Embassy for collaborating, hosting the event here at the Fellowship of the Nordic Embassies. We have our friends from Brookings. Ben Harris is here and Robin Brooks is over there. Thanks, guys. This has been tremendous that we got this off the road and are here. Look forward to much more cooperation to come. And thanks for making the trip looking so fresh after a transatlantic journey. That's fantastic. We're particularly grateful as well for our Ukrainian friends. Vladislav Glasiuk, the Ukrainian Sanctions Coordinator, is going to be with us online, I hope, and Natalia Shapovalov from the Kiev School of Economics, who is in Copenhagen tonight. So not quite, but you know, there is a Nordic connection here as well. Tobias Tiberg from the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Tjörben Becker from the Stockholm School of Economics. So also lots of thanks for you for making this effort. And last but not least, from Berlin, Niklas Wagner from the German Foreign Office, the Auswärtiges Amt, and the moderators, as you said. I don't want to take a lot of time because I'm the least important person here. I happen to be in the situation that I can actually talk about this topic on the back of some research that I've done myself. Sometimes, I'm not just opening conferences, I'm also sitting in front of a computer and doing proper economic research still. And I've actually worked on 2 papers in last year that have a lot to say about this. The first one is I'm a macro person, so I don't have the patience to look to like micro trade data. This is above my pay grade, so other people do that. So we wrote this macro paper about the effectiveness of sanctions. And looked at basically all the sanctions episodes that we've had in the past 100 years. There are quite a few. And what did we find? We found that, of course, sanctions are not the secret source that ends all conflict overnight. But sanctions work. Sanctions hurt. They typically, for each GDP and trade that's sanctioned, GDP output falls by something like 0.5 percentage point. So if you accumulate these effects over time, sanctions bite, and they retard economic development, they slow down technological development. So they're not something that is sometimes mentioned in the press that they hurt us more than them. No, they do work, they just take time to work. The second paper is one that relates to the effect of sanctions, namely cutting off countries from the financial resources needed to wage war. And so what we've done in that other paper I've just presented last week in Switzerland actually is to ask what is the role of money in deciding the outcome of wars, deciding, it's an old question, Napoleon famously, his Maltese treasure sank and his African campaign ran out of money, and that was kind of the beginning of the end. So what is the role of money in deciding wars? And that links to what the ambassador just said. Our Ukraine support track, of course, measures the support, the financial support, the humanitarian, the military support to Ukraine. And what we find in the paper, and if I sort of combine this with what we know from Ukraine support tracker, there's two messages, 2 points I want to bring across. The first one is, of course, money plays a role. We roughly find that for a 10% of GDP transfer and financial resources, the chances of winning the war increase by 5%. That might not be a lot, but if you think about large transfers along the lines that we've seen, for example, during world wars and other conflicts, help, support, financial aid can really make a difference for the war effort. And that brings me to really the very last point, which is our Ukraine support tracker. If you look at the financial military support that Germany, the US, other big economies, and I'm taking off some of our Nordic friends who've really made an effort relative to their economic resources. German military support for Ukraine over the past 4 years averages to the incredibly, embarrassingly low number of 0.15% of German GDP per annum. It's from a macroeconomic perspective, it's a rounding error. we have not done much to support Ukraine in this horrible war of aggression that's been waged against us. And we could have done much more. And I give you historical examples. The one example is Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who many of you remember during the first Gulf War, wrote a check equivalent to 0.7% of German GDP just away in 1 year for a war that was, equally a war of aggression, but far away and much less threatening to us. So there is clear upside for what we have to do. And the research I've done, and I think the research that some of the topics we'll touch tonight in the debate, will also make clear that by far the most efficient way, and we're talking a lot in this country about defense and ramping up or investing in our defense, by far the most efficient way to increase security in Europe is to increase support for Ukraine. And the terrible situation that our friends in Kiev and other places in Ukraine are facing right now did not come overnight. We could have seen it coming. We could have ramped up defense production in time. We could have done our share. Obviously, things are complex, but we have the resources, the financial and economic resources to do much more. And that's not instead of sanctions that we're talking about now, but this is a complement to sanctions. And I hope that we will find in Europe the political will very soon to put our money where our words are. And so far, I think some of the big countries clearly haven't done that. But I'm not here to give a lecture. I'm here to introduce, and I'm very much looking forward to the first panel. And I hand over to Jim. Yeah, perfect. Right. And then you go ahead and introduce our.
Yeah, come on up, guys. Come on up. Okay. Right. Thank you. Thank you. All right, thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to moderate this panel and to talk about this issue, and we'll get into a bunch of the history about it in just a second. But first, here is who you are hearing from. Torbjörn Becker is the director of the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics at the Stockholm School of Economics. Ben Harris, who I have known for a long time, is the Vice President and Director of Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. Julian Hinz is the Professor of International Economics at Bielefeld University and the head of the Research Center Trade Policy at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And Natalia, who is joining us online, Shapoval, is the Vice President for Policy Research at the Kiev School of Economics Institute. So thank you all for being here. And we're just going to dive right in with a little bit of level setting. We are the just the facts, ma'am panel, but we're also going to have just the policy recommendations, sir, after that. And we'll start here. Torbjörn, can you give us kind of a lay of the land on where the Russian economy is today after years and years of sanctions?
Short answer, not sure. Because we don't really know if we can trust the Russian economic data that's coming out. But I actually have one slide that I may be allowed to put up.
Yeah, this is a very important rule.
Yeah, okay.
One slide.
One slide. Is this the right thing to click? All right. So what I'm arguing now is that Russia has not reinvented its macro model from before the war. So given that, we can look what the economy, how it worked before the war. So this happens to be the world's simplest macro model. Seriously. And some of you are econometrically trained and you would say you cannot do correlations from this, but I can put it in the shapes and forms that we can make. Anyway, bottom line, Russia depends heavily on oil incomes. And the international oil price is like the most significant thing to focus on when we think about limiting the resources available to Russia. Okay, what are they doing now? Basically, they have been spending their savings. They can't really borrow in international markets. We have to focus on pushing down the price that we're paying for Russian oil. So that's how we get them deeper into red numbers going forward. limiting the resources that Putin has available to wage the war in Ukraine. You know, it also says here we should think about what we can do on the cost side to tighten the budget constraint. But really, we do see now that sanctions do bite. They are quite nervous and worried when they have their discussions about the macroeconomic situation in Russia. We need to push this further, and I hope some of you will discuss exactly how we're going to do our sanctions policies on oil and gas. So I'll stop with that.
That's great. That's great. And excellent use of your one chart and your multiple axes on the right and left. I like that a lot. Ben, so I've known Ben since before he was in the Biden administration, and I covered the Biden administration for the Times, covered economic policy, and actually was on a trip to Germany with the president for the Group of Seven meeting at Strasse Mau in 2022, and enjoying what was sort of the equivalent of the only downtime you were going to get on a Biden international trip, which was kind of an evening at the press hotel in the Alps, when I got a call from a member of the Biden administration, who is not Ben, who was like, hey, we're going to do this thing to cap the price of Russian oil. Are you interested? And at the time, I was thinking about it a lot in sort of the economic terms, what would be the economic effects on oil prices, because Americans were very, very concerned about the high price of gasoline in the summer of 2022. But it was obviously also a big, important part of America's response to the invasion of Ukraine. And Ben, I'm wondering if you, who were an architect of this plan, could talk us through what you had in mind to start and how it's actually played out in terms of its effects and what we can say sort of the price cap and sanctions have done to affect Russia's economy.
Sure. So let me just say from the outset, on behalf of the Brookings Institution, thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you to the Kiel Institute. Thank you to the Swedish Embassy. I sincerely hope this is, as you said at the beginning, the start of something which is a continued relationship. But now moving on to Jim's question. So I think there was speculation with respect to the price cap, that the price cap was put in place to keep oil prices low and nothing else. And I can tell you, having been one of the senior officials at the Treasury Department, that is not the case. If you remember in 2022, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the price of oil had spiked. And the global macroeconomic outlook was very different than it is today. And so our real fear, and this was confirmed by projections from US banks, was that by decreasing Russian oil output, we would actually leave Russia in a better spot because the price of oil would spike and profits would increase. There was actually a report which came out of a major US bank that said if Russian oil production was shut in, the price of crude would be over $300 per barrel. Imagine what that does to Russian GDP for this chart if oil is $300 per barrel. That was totally unacceptable to us. This meant much more revenues for Putin to fight the war in Ukraine. And so we thought if we can't control quantity, we want to control price. And when it comes to crude, you have to be on one side of this. I mean, as you're thinking through your mental framework for how to sanction Russia, the first thing to think about is, do you want to control price, which was novel about the price cap, or do you want to control quantity, which is what the United States and others have been doing with Iran and other countries for a long time. We decided we wanted to try to control price, which was the whole motivation behind the price cap. Now, how has it gone? I mean, I've learned some lessons from this exercise. One, particularly with a country like Russia, sanctions are a dynamic game. It's not a one and done. I mean, congratulations to the EU and the UK and honestly the rest of the G7, other than the US, for lowering the price cap on crude. I would like to see the other two price caps also lowered. It's time. But this is a dynamic game. And so it's a case of the G7 is up, and then Russia's up, and then there's a response. Now, unfortunately, so that's the first lesson I've learned, is that it's a dynamic game. The second lesson that I've learned is that enforcement is everything. You can come up with as good of a sanctions regime in theory as you want. If you're not engaged in enforcement, it's not going to be worth the paper that it was written on. And the United States, to be honest, has done a poor job of enforcement, particularly since the start of the Trump administration, when we have sanctioned exactly 0 tankers. Not one tanker has been sanctioned under the Trump administration. this is the easiest move one could possibly make. I mean, the numbers, the IMO listings are right there. It would take a few weeks. It's not a hard thing to do. So I would say with respect to the price cap, Jim, I think it was probably the right, I mean, you can't run a counterfactual, but assuming that it kept oil out of the 150s or 160s, I think it was probably the right move, but enforcement could have been much better.
Yeah. No, okay, great. Thank you. That's the most self-critical I've ever heard you be about the price cap, so I appreciate that. Natalia, I want to bring you in virtually here and just ask for a broader picture look at energy sanctions. Sort of how have they worked overall? Do you think, and sort of where have they left us as we enter 2026?
Yes, thank you very much for having me online. Indeed, so the big objective was that with the sanctions on the energy sector, Russia can get, as Sternberg said, a collapse in their economy. And right now, what we are coming to is that in 2026, their revenues can actually get to 160 billion from more than 200 in the previous years, like in 2022, 2023. So now they're really getting to 150, 160 billion. And this is a very significant loss. And if there are going to be maritime service ban or some additional measures during the year, that can drop the oil export revenues further down. So that being said, with the energy sector, with gas, it's not sanctioned per se, but Russia is losing the gas. So the sunset dates are already there for 2026, 2027, LNG and pipeline by Europe. And it means that they are losing it basically in the long run. So if you're talking about how it works, of course, the shadow fleet, now it's like 75% or so in the crude market, for example. This is a significant part, and maybe like 25% of the shadow fleet tankers that are designated, they continue moving, continue their transactions. So the one can say that probably this is not working. However, we do see that markets, like how it was with Lukoil, with Rosneft sanctions, how it was initially with the designations, there is always 2-3 months period where the markets react, and this gives a significant drop in Russian oil revenues. Everyone is confused a little bit, and as a totality right now, together with the pressure on demand on the global markets and with additional sanctions, we think that they are going to lose significantly.
Thank you. Okay, so we're obviously talking thus far just about the groups of countries that have attempted to sanction Russia, but it's a bigger game than that. There are more players, and so I want Julian to bring in your chart, which I think is the coolest visually of all the charts that anybody brought. But talk us through China's role here and how they fit in.
Yeah, so let me
look at all those colors.
Yeah, maybe it's a bit too colorful. So I think so. Until now, we've been talking about the income side essentially of how Russia is still making money, whereas with the economic model of Russia not having changed really, that also means that they still need to import all the stuff that they were previously importing. And so previously they were importing a lot from the EU. I mean, just look at the map and you see where the obvious close trading partners for Russia are. This is Western Europe, both for selling oil, but also for buying all the stuff that they want. We talked about luxury goods before. We talked about all the nice things, but it's also all the things that they need now to produce weaponry, to produce to keep the industrial machine and the war machine going. And so obviously one of the first things that the European did is try to stop that flow of the immediately weapons-related goods, and then that list was extended over time and time. Not only the Europeans, other allied countries as well. But what you also see very much in the data, and this is not big news, is that China has really been stepping in, and it really is China. I think it really boils down to China is stepping in. There is some sanctions circumvention in the sense that through third countries, and sometimes there is more than just one step. You still have Western products, European products going to Russia, but the bulk of the problem, if you will, is China still, or now pitching in for those exports that don't come from Europe anymore. I think it does. So a couple of colleagues at the Kiel Institute and affiliated researchers we've been looking at the microdata that Moritz is scared of looking at. And so this is a study that's coming out towards the end of February for essentially the anniversary of, if you will, of this horrible tragedy. Is a colleague from Antwerp, Konstantin Egorov, who has had access to Russian trade data, Russian customs data. And so with the graphs I'm showing you is not some aggregated data that you find online publicly, but this is Russian import data. They still continue to record all the things, and you can still trace. I mean, we can doubt how good the information is, but it looks remarkably good, and you can still trace the companies that were producing products and where it was sold from. And what you see is that some products that are clearly very much Western made are now just entering through China, through middlemen. And so we still see the company's name that is producing it, and then we see the shipper going into Russia. And so I think there are some very obvious policy conclusions that one should draw from this, that how can this still be the case that the Western products get to Russia, but maybe that's something more for the second panel later on. Right, I'll stop here, and I'm happy to talk much more about all that microdata.
Great. Okay. So this is a great baseline, and this ends the part of the panel where I'm just going to call on everybody one by one. What I now would love for you to do is just to start talking to each other about answers to this. And I guess my first big question is, what is obviously missing right now? What does the research suggest is missing in the efforts to deny revenues and economic activity to Russia?
So I'm happy to jump in. I think what's happened is fairly obvious, which is Russia has amassed a massive shadow fleet on the order of around 7 tankers per month. And Robin Brooks, who's in the audience here, and I have done a lot of research on this, not just tracking the share of the tankers that have been added, but their provenance, where they came from. And we're actually tracking on a tanker-by-tanker basis as they leave Russia. So whatever you were going to do in March 2021 or 2022 on the invasion has got to be updated given the presence of the shadow fleet. And so I think that Europe has one major asset here, which is that much of Russian tankers need to travel through European waters in order to get to China or India or wherever they're going. That is a huge asset. So what we did, Robin and myself, my research assistant Leah Marshall, and a couple of members of the faculty at Yale Law School, we came up with a proposal, which we actually released this morning, that was based on a Kiev School of Economics proposal, with the idea being, for your consideration, Europe, which is to say there's a real pain point in terms of uninsured shadow fleet tankers traveling through European waters. And you should, I don't want to use a should because it's not appropriate to come here and say it, you might want to consider taking advantage of that asset. And so how would that happen? That would happen by demanding liability, not just for the tanker operators that are running very old ships at a real risk of environmental disaster, but they're also running them without insurance. And the pain point here are the flagging states. And so, do we have the other? So,
I just want everyone to know that this has been violating the one chart rule. This has Ben's first of 2 charts.
So I don't know if the second, okay. So these are the flagging states. And so what we did, I'm failing at this. Okay. So we went ahead and we looked at all the voyages that left the Baltic ports in Russia over the first half of 2025, and we did retrospective modeling. So there are 333 different voyages. We looked at those, we classified them in 1 and 2 different groups. Those are compliant and non-compliant. They're non-compliant if they're a member of the shadow fleet or if they come from an unknown flagging status. So this is about 65% of the voyages that left Russia were non-compliant. And what we asked is how could we actually force them into compliance? And the working theory here is because you can't really control China, and it's very difficult to control India. The United States levied a 25% incremental tariff on China for purchasing Russian oil. It didn't matter at all. The actual imports from India went up after that 25% tariff was levied. So what you want to do is go ahead and control the price And the way to control the price is by demanding liability for not just the tanker operators, but for the flagging states. And the legal argument is all laid out in this paper that we wrote with Yale Law School. But here is the outcome under 4 different scenarios, and I'll be quick here. You can just go to the last column. And so the last 3 rows are this plan under different levels of enforcement. And what we found under very strict enforcement, which includes possibly interdicting with uninsured tankers, putting diplomatic pressure on these flagging states that are acting as flags of convenience, and possibly levying secondary sanctions on these countries that are allowing uninsured ships to join the registries, that you can change Russian revenues coming out of Baltic ports by 14%. You can reduce it by up to 14%. Now, there is a global price shock because some of the exports won't occur. So we find that under this last scenario, you're going to find about a 2.5% change in the price of crude. But for my calculus, that's a price worth paying for a 15% reduction in Russian revenues coming out of the Baltics. So that's our proposal. It was released this morning, for your consideration.
Others on what's missing?
Natalia was online.
Yeah, Natalia, do you want to take that too?
Yes, thank you. So I think I agree a lot about the shadow tankers and the importance to make next steps. So we have an international lawyer in the team, and like when I ask her, okay, is it possible legally to stop tankers if they are like old, shitty tankers, risk for environment, unclear insurance? 1 out of 5 of them would be without flags or known flags or false flags. So the answer is yes, like you can stop tankers. However, the next step after countries are stopping the tankers, like it was with France, before with Estonia, with US, what is happening next? And we already seen both in countries, but also with these shadow tankers, that Russia is ready to bring drones, to bring their military ships. And for me personally, I think that's the next question to solve. Like, what is the strategy towards really stopping and having punishment for these shadow tankers, for captains, people who operate them, and how to prepare for the response? What should be these geographical points where that can be happening, and whether Europe is frankly prepared to that? Because we know Russia, so they will be, I think, open, and they will intervene with the drones and with the military ships. And what's going to be so for us, it's the big deal how to prepare for this during this year. And I absolutely agree with the colleague that there is a great opportunity with this false flags and with poor insurance that gives maybe a little bit additional comfort to countries who would like to use some more legal leverage against Russia. Thank you.
Can I just add? I mean, we also, of course, have to think about restocking the fleet of tankers. How can we still allow companies, including in the EU, to sell stuff to Russia that they can use to evade sanctions? I mean, that's unbelievable to me. We know where some of these tankers come from. Why didn't we stop that a long time ago? So, let's think about that as well, maybe.
Go, please.
If I can pitch in here, I totally agree. At the EU level, we've been thinking in the past couple of years a lot about value chains, but looking more upstream and looking at what's happening in value chains. Corporate responsibility upstream. But I think you can also, with some not too creative thought, actually see, okay, really think about where companies are selling to, or selling to an nth degree, second, third degree. I think it's quite obvious. I mean, the data that we have here it's not publicly available. You can buy it quite easily, and it's baffling to me how we can still see that many Western companies through 1 or 2 steps still selling to this day those goods that are very much sanctioned since sort of the second day of the war. So it's unclear to me how there's not much more enforcement of these rules. There are some rules on this. Yeah. But I think it's blatantly obvious. We've been thinking a lot about value chains going upstream. You know, companies need to make sure that all of that is clean. I think we should also look downstream.
Do the data suggest a good choke point for attacking this? If you wanted to try to stop it, do the data show you where to go?
Yeah, well, I think there are the obvious candidates. So we've also looked at Turkish data, for example, and it's very clear that there's a big uptick in imports from Europe then going to Turkey in products that happen to be sanctioned towards Russia. And so then it's a bit murky what happens after Turkey, but it's very clear that that's one of the places where things are going through. What is interesting, though, is that looking at these charts, these were values, and so values don't really matter in this calculation. What matters is quantities, right? We want them to have ideally zero of this stuff, but if they do get this stuff, then actually we want them to pay a relatively high price. And so looking at values here is sometimes, I think, a bit misleading. And what we do find with Turkish data is that they pay up to 40%. So the things that the Turkish firm buys is being sold again in the same month or the next month with a 40% surcharge on this, and so that suggests really that the stuff that is still going to Russia is sold there for a much higher price. But still, I mean, this is data that's we got the data, right? So it seems like the other people should also be able to trace this and then try to hunt down how they still get the stuff.
Can I just fill in a little bit on? We have to also remember, again, I had it on my one slide, that Putin has a budget constraint. So if prices go up by 40-50% on imports, that's going to tighten how much space he has to buy and produce rockets and all of these things. So we have to also be very clear with the messaging. The fact that they can still buy stuff on detour ways doesn't mean that sanctions don't have an impact or an effect. So when we have this discussion with media and policymakers, please remember that it matters to Ukraine if they can produce 10 rockets or 50 rockets or 100 rockets. And you know, this is not an argument for we should not do sanctions because they don't work. They do tighten the budget constraint, and we just have to make sure they work more efficiently. But, you know, this is a very important point.
How firm is the budget constraint? So if Ben's right and you really could reduce revenues by 14%, is that a 14% drop in how much Putin has to spend on weapons?
No, because Putin can basically say that we're going to take your pension, we're not going to pay the teachers, we're not going to build a road. So we also have to realize that it's an autocracy. Putin has access to all of the resources of the Russian economy if he wants, but we have to make the choice of waging the war more and more difficult for Putin and his Kremlin guys. So we have to also not be in this sphere of saying, look, sanctions don't work because the war didn't stop. You know, that's the wrong mindset. We're going to make it more and more difficult for Putin and his leadership to wage the war because the priorities he has to make in Russia are going to be more and more difficult, and people are not going to be happy at the end of the day.
Almost a political fiscal constraint.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, along those lines, I started this off by saying I learned 2 lessons. There's actually a third one which came to me, which is that frictions really matter. So I think it was in the 6th sanctions package when the EU banned the import of Russian oil. That really mattered, not so much for the overall price of Russian oil, but for the frictions it introduced. So instead of 4-day trips from Baltic ports to Rotterdam, we're talking about 3-week trips to ports in Mumbai. That was a real cost, not just the cost for the tankers, but the cost of ensuring that really mattered. And so, you know, ultimately the goal is to reduce revenues as close to zero. And one of the ways to do that is to introduce frictions and make it really hard for Russia to trade. Pivoting for a second, the second point I want to make is that the US environment right now, in terms of this posture towards Russia, is very different than it was a year ago. So one of his final acts in office was Joe Biden sanctioning hundreds of tankers in January before the inauguration of President Trump. President Trump has only taken 2 actions with respect to sanctions on the Russian oil trade. One is the 25% incremental tariff on India that I mentioned earlier, which is very confusing to me because why only India? Why not also China? Why not any of the other importers of Russian crude? And also, why only crude? Why not diesel? Why not naphtha? Why about all these other refined products that matter a lot for Russia's budget constraint? So right now in the US Senate, there is a bill that proposes 500% tariffs, basically embargo-level tariffs, secondary tariffs on any country that imports Russian oil. It has 85 co-sponsors around in the Senate. Right now in the US Senate, you don't have 85 co-sponsors on anything. You cannot get senators to agree on anything. And they all agree on a 500% incremental. Now, I have thoughts on the bill. There are pros and cons. But the point is, it's been sitting in the US Senate for a long time, sponsored by Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican, and this has no prospect of passing in the medium term. So my message to Europe is, it is in your hands. I would not put your faith in the Trump administration when it comes to energy sanctions on Russia.
But Ben, can I push you on one quick thing? The president did announce a trade agreement that we don't know a lot about with India just in the last 24 hours, which allegedly includes India agreeing not to buy Russian crude anymore, right? Do you believe that?
So most trade agreements have thousands of pages of text. The trade agreements, they're not really agreements, they're frameworks. And the Trump administration are roughly 3 or 4 pages. They're rough frameworks. There aren't enforcement mechanisms. Look, if India stops buying Russian crude, that is great news. A, because China cannot take all of it. And B, you've handed China the greatest leverage they could possibly have. If you thought a $25 spread between Urals and Brent was large, wait till China's the only buyer. I mean, this is monopsony if we want to get into economics at its finest. But I'm somewhat skeptical that that will actually come to pass, just given the Trump administration's record.
Does anybody else have a different thought than that on the possibility of India no longer buying American or buying Russian crude?
No, but we have to be serious about the discussion with both India and China on all of these other trade things. So, you know, this is one positive development, if you want to say that, still to be evaluated, of course. But also this fact that we think that we can't have a serious discussion with China about how they deal with Russia when our economy is 10 times the size of the Russian economy. Why on earth are we so afraid of putting any kind of pressure on China from Europe? To me, that's just amazingly poor leadership. Sorry, Europe.
Yeah, just attacking all of Europe there, so you didn't offend anyone in the crowd by singling them out. I appreciate that. Elaine, did you want
to? No, I couldn't agree more.
Okay. We're going to take some questions from the audience in just a minute, but I kind of want to go back to looking forward here. We've talked about a lot of things to try to cut off supply. We've talked about possible effects on the Russian fiscal situation if you can continue to do that. Should we at all worry about the effects on global oil prices now, because you do model some of those, or are we in a different global environment on that than we were a few years ago?
So I said from the outset, you have to pick a side. You want to control price, or do you want to control quantity? And part of that calculus, you have to have a price elasticity. So I'm using a lot of economics terms here, but you have to decide if you're going to shut in Russian oil, what is that going to do to the global price of oil? And what is that going to do to Russian revenue? That's got to be part of your calculation. If you don't have that, you don't get a weigh in on the debate. And so, I guess my general point here, Jim, is that it's a different environment. I'm less concerned about price shocks. I'm also, this is just a personal value judgment, I'm willing to pay a lot more for gas if it means ending this damn war. And I think that at the time we put in place the price cap, we didn't know it would be lasting this long. My hope is that there's the similar sentiment around the world in terms of willing to pay more if we need to. But paying more, as you saw from the chart at the outset, means more revenue to Russia. So it's a different environment. I don't think $285 barrel price is really in the cards right now. But if you shut up Russian production, it wouldn't be crazy to go up to $150 a barrel. And that's great news for Putin as long as he's exporting some.
But that's the thing, though, back to your enforcement. If we can enforce no exports from Russia, we can live with the $150. And if they're actually exporting, I don't think the price goes to 150. So we also have to make up our minds. Do we think that we can, have sanctions that are actually enforceable when it comes to limiting Russia's supply? If we can't, then we're back to the same market equilibrium. So I'm not sure how we should think about that, to be honest.
Well, Natalia made a really good point, where I think you were thinking 2 steps ahead of us, which was what happens if all the tankers that are transporting Russian oil are Russian tankers? What if it's a full shadow fleet situation insured by cut-rate Russian insurance going to Chinese and Indian ports? What do we do then? I mean, we're quickly headed there. The shadow fleet is massive. There's going to be, by the way, I'm sure you know this, there's going to be an oil spill. There were 2 in the Black Sea. We have BBC looking at satellite images, 15-mile long, maybe 15-kilometer long oil slicks, enormous cost. We don't really know what it was. The average, when I showed you those compliant and non-compliant tankers at the outset, the average age of a compliant tanker was 12.4 years. The average age of a non-compliant tanker was 19.0 years. That's the average age. If I'm living anywhere near a coast, I'm terrified of an oil spill coming out of these just barely seaworthy Russian tankers.
Natalia?
Thank you for the ball. And so you're gonna have today another speaker, Vlad Vlasyuk, and he has a great idea that I would like to cite. So Ukraine already started sanctioning captains of the tankers. And I think this idea of individual responsibility of people who facilitate Russia, many of them, at least in the case of Ukraine, who were sanctioned, they are not Russian citizens, some are, but others, they are coming from all kind of places, and for them, it's kind of too much of a burden. So making this market dirty for individuals might be, something that happens before some nuclear options that I think still need to be thought through, and borders of all countries should be equipped with interceptors of drones. But there are some maybe smaller measures that can be done like now more easily. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, we'll go to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I think someone will find you. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Venezuela. Venezuela is the country with the largest reserves in the world. So would you think that if European and American companies are able to kickstart production to pre-Chavez levels, that would flood the market with petrol, so that if Russian oil were to be restricted, that would not spike prices?
So I don't know specifically about Venezuela. I will say that when I was at the Treasury Department, one idea that I liked was to conditionally backfill any reductions in Russian production. So if Putin chose to treat oil the way he chose to treat natural gas and weaponize that commodity, my thought was that you would have some natural backfill. To say, you want to cut off $1 million a day, 1 million barrels a day? Well, we'll just backfill it. There's an opportunity with oil producers around the world to play that role. I'm not sure there's a will.
Right. Yes.
Hi, my name is Liza Vogt. I'm from the BBC News. My question is, I would like to ask you to talk a little bit more about secondary sanctions, because you mentioned the alternative to that, but is it really possible in your mind to hurt the seller without hurting the buyer, if it makes sense?
I'm not sure it is. I mean, secondary sanctions right now are a real opportunity, particularly for India. I think that on a national level, that probably won't be successful for the reasons I cited earlier. But on a port-by-port level and cutting off access to the dollar, that could be a real opportunity. I think the threat of secondary sanctions and the Lukoil sanction that came out of the Besant Treasury, it really scared people. And we talked about the spread. I mean, you saw the spread widen in the days following that announcement. It took a long time for I mean, now it looks like Lukoil will be sold to Carlyle Group for maybe $20 billion. I don't know how much. I mean, the assets are priced at $22 billion. But secondary sanctions are a real opportunity, but they have to be biting. And our big test on secondary sanctions failed miserably with respect to India. And so my thought is, we may want to experiment with port-by-port secondary sanctions and cut off access to the dollar.
Do you see it happening, secondary sanctions?
Not out of the U.S. I mean, sorry, if I wasn't clear, the U.S. is not stepping up here. I mean, it's not going to happen because we've had a whole year of evidence, and there's some very easy sanctions that the U.S. could take, and we have chosen not to. So will it happen? I'm quite skeptical.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Maria Shagina, International Institute for Strategic Studies. I'd like to broaden the discussion and include the other key topic for Russia's war economy is export controls, and ask the panel about the recommendations for improving enforcement on export controls on technology, something that Julian also alluded to, and his graph shows the role of China in supplying critical products that are coming from Hong Kong and Beijing as well. What more can be done? Is it just corporate responsibility? Is it secondary measures along those lines? How to improve supply chain visibility in this? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think, as I said a couple of times now, this is very easy to get data. And so you see companies in there that have their headquarters in Europe or in Western countries, and it seems, and these are not one-off transactions. These are, actually, I mean, these are value chains. It's downstream from the European producers, from the Western producers, and you see that this, yes, it takes apparently 2 or 3 steps to reach China, but then it goes to Russia onwards from there. And so, once these are not one-off transactions, I think there needs to be alarm bells in the headquarters of these European companies that this will face, this has consequences. And yes, there are steps towards going there, but I think there's a lot of space in going there because this is not hard to get information. And I think that I find puzzling, to be honest. The graphs I showed you there, essentially, I mean, it's not a one simple story that you can tell with this. There are very different products that you cannot sell to Russia anymore for good reasons. And it depends really on the product. So if you look at microchips, those were predominantly sold from Western Europe to Russia, even though they were not produced in Russia, but predominantly sold through Europe to Russia. And so now it's more than 95% of those exact same microchips that are sold through China. Okay, so there maybe there's less that one can do immediately through China, but it's the same companies producing them because these are not produced just easily anywhere in the world. The second type of good on the other extreme are washing machines. So there's previously European brand washing machines were the big washing machine brands on the Russian market. Now it's close to zero. So who stepped in here? This may be not as much of a concern, maybe still a little bit, but not as much of a concern. These are largely actual Chinese producers producing this stuff. And so, China stepping in has sort of different meanings here. So for some stuff, it's, I think, critical and crucial and actually quite easy to look at why this is happening and how this is happening and through whom. And for others, it's still easy to see, but maybe of less relevance when it's about washing machines.
Yeah. Natalia?
I think it's a very important question, and it's critical to shift more responsibility to corporations whose components are being identified on the battlefield. And for them to have this basically cost of doing business to control their supply chains. I think in 2024, it was very productive work on companies and governments trying to engage business into identifying and making investigations of what they're doing, what their components are making in Russia. And now, unfortunately, I don't see that. And what we see, on the contrary, in Kiev is that more and more drones and rockets that rely on the components, they are still coming to Russia, to Ukraine. So I think that's critical to shift that it's like the company who's responsible, even if it was produced in China or elsewhere, it's still like Intel chip, and this is they are part of business to identify who is buying their products. And one more thing is, so on data you're saying it's like easily available. There is criminal responsibility in Russia. So if it would be identified that this data was leaked, then people gonna have problems. So, but it's indeed very important to see this trait. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I think we've got time for one more. So if anybody else has a question? Yeah, in the back there. Yeah. Yes, yes. Come on, guys, some European handicapping. Let's do it.
That's more for the second panel, I guess, no? Question is whether they can talk as freely as we can.
What a great segue to the second panel. So, thank you to our first panel here, Natalia. Thank you for joining us virtually, and thank you all for the great questions. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. So, hello and welcome to the second part of today's fantastic event. I think the first panel effectively threw out the gauntlet and said, here are all of the different things that could be done, and now the challenge for you is to say, will you do it? Kindly joining us today from Ukraine, despite all the many challenges of doing so, is Vladislav Vlasyuk, who is sanctions advisor to Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and also a research fellow at the Kiev School of Economics. And then we have Dr. Nicholas Wagner, who's the director for Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia at the German Federal Foreign Office. And in the blue and yellow corner, we have Tobias Steiberg, head of the unit for Eastern Europe and Central Asia at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs.
We have two people in the blue and yellow corner.
Yes.
Deputy Minister Vlasyuk and myself.
That's true, that's right. Good point. So all our panelists in this second half of the evening play a leading role in shaping and designing the sanctions that are then imposed, and then also doing the difficult political work of pushing them through and getting that unity that was just mentioned by our last question. So the main question that we have for this moment is so what next? So where do we go from here? And this 20th sanctions package is being produced, and we'll talk about that at length. But I think to start off with, it would be great to go to Vladislav in Kiev. And Vladislav, maybe you could give us your take as someone who is lobbying sanctions policy, talking to different capitals around the world. What are the biggest gaps that you see at the moment? What are the gaps that you hope to see filled in 2026? And which ones of those gaps are the most sort of, I guess, militarily and fiscally important for Russia?
Thank you so much. Hope you can hear me well. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me for this event. I think that is very important, especially at the beginning of the year, to set this stand, to set the pace for the things which are to start happening, hopefully, for this year. So of course, this is important. And yes, this is true that I have just came back from a trip, a couple of places in Europe, in Berlin, by the way, and Copenhagen. And yes, this is also true that we were discussing a lot of, let's say, most pushing issues. But before I come to those, I mean, to the gaps, let me step aside and tell, like, look, there's been an ongoing, really difficult negotiation. Those trilateral, Ukraine, the UN, the Russians. And many people very rightfully have a feeling that we are the only one being pressed. And at the same time, everybody understands that reaching long-lasting peace or any other resolution of this conflict that requires compromises from. What I'm kind of hinting is that it's so important, so crucial now that someone would be feeling the pressure of the Russian. So this is really the moment to increase the pressure with the sanctions. And I have a feeling that all the major capitals do realize that, and the anti-sanctions package, I understand, is coming out. It's all right. It will also help that the other capitals, London and Tokyo and Ottawa, they all will be coming up with sanctions, and thus increase sanctions pressure. And Canada was thinking a lot about teaching Prime Minister Carney. Yeah, I mean, I do think that everybody has to be able to protect them. Some gaps. Speaking of the sanctions, the main gap would be the pace. Not for the first time, we are seeing the situation when there are some kind of more or less obvious decision to be taken. Then those go for lengthy discussions, which might take a year or 2 years. But finally, that happens. The general idea would be if we could kind of cut off a lot of, these deliberations and just get quick to the point of certain matter. One of the good examples of those would be the anti-circumvention tool. I really expect that the at least suggested to be within the anti-sanctions package. We'll see if that would be supported. The other topic would be what exactly would be suggested within this anti-circumvention, but at least let's have some. But again, that's something that's been implemented 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, like an possibility. Then it was discussed in July in sanctions package, then it was being discussed starting September of the 19th sanctions package, and it will get into there. And still we are kind of coming eventually. So why did we have to spend the half of a year at least and not having done it there? Same goes with the shadow fleet. I think that many would agree that some of the actions finally taken have been done long before. I think that eventually we will come to the more, let's say, structured sanctions against the ecosystem of the shadow fleet, including the mentioned sanctions, captains of
Vladislav, I'm just going to ask you, do you think we could try, because the connection is a little bit patchy, could we try without video for a little bit, just to see if your voice is clearer through that?
Okay.
Let's try that. So
speaking of the captains of the shadow fleet, well,
Captains of the shadow fleet,
we do believe that, you know, a lot of people have been deliberately violating sanctions put on the vessels of the fleet and on the oil in general. I mean, all right, so now they have to face the consequences for that. And I mean, we can kind of talk about more of the gaps. Some of those would be really on the topic of the components. Some of that would be on the topic of the financial institutions, and many would agree that the sanctions imposed on selected cryptocurrency exchanges or companies in a way that were not exactly...
Vladislav, I'm so sorry, we're struggling to hear. Do you think you could try to log in again, and in the meantime we will discuss some of those points which we hear slightly patchy, I'm afraid. Do you think you could try...
Okay.
Log out and log in, sorry. But thank you. We tried. I think we got the general gist, but we can go back over some of those points. But let's talk about those gaps. Tobias, maybe you could tell us what, you know, Ambassador Wand-Danielsson talked about the 20th sanctions package from the Swedish perspective. What are your main targets with that, and what do you think, you know, what will work?
So thank you, and with your permission, before answering your question, I just want to sort of backtrack to a sort of very basic question: why are we doing this? And I think for the Swedish government, it is absolutely unambiguously clear that no effort to achieve any kind of even vaguely acceptable result out of peace negotiations with Russia have even the remotest chance of delivering results that would be acceptable from the point of view of European security without increasing pressure on Russia. This is absolutely necessary. And I think even, you know, even with that happening, I don't think that that any results from the ongoing negotiations can be guaranteed. But even in that scenario, sanctions will make it harder for Russia to wage this war of aggression. Now, Sweden emphatically agrees with the point made by Deputy Minister Vlasiuk, that the pace of introducing and beefing up sanctions should be higher. Now, coming to the 20th package that you asked about, sort of there's two sets of logic behind what Sweden is promoting ahead of the 20th sanctions package. The first one is to more aggressively strangle the revenues going to the Russian state. And the second one is about circumvention. So I'll just very briefly sort of line up the issues that we're focusing on. Revenues for us is about two things. It's about energy and it's about trade. So starting off with energy, Sweden is promoting a full maritime services ban against any and every Russian vessel which carries carbon energy, be that you know, oil, LNG, coal, doesn't matter. Subsequently, our intention is that no European operator should be able to provide any service of any kind to a Russian vessel except those services which we will be obliged to provide in the case of an accident at sea or something like that, which is a legal obligation under the international law of the sea. So that's the first thing, a full maritime services ban. We very, very much hope that our partners in the G7 will join Europe in doing that. Key, obviously, is the United States, and we've heard on the previous panel that U.S. policies on sanctions and on energy sanctions isn't absolutely clear in the course of the last year, but we were encouraged that the Secretary of the Treasury, Bessent, at the end of last year circulated a proposal for a full maritime services ban. So we're hopeful that the current U.S. presidential administration would agree to join a proposal of that nature. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Sweden feels that the EU should do what the United States and the United Kingdom have already done, which is to fully sanction Lukoil and Rosneft. Lukoil is currently not under Russian sanctions and EU sanctions, and Rosneft is only under partial sanctions. And the third thing we want to do is to work much more aggressively on sanctioning enablers of the shadow fleet. That's a really tricky business. There's a whole ecosystem of entities and operators, and it's a game of cat and mouse. You achieve something in one end, and then something else pops up in the other end. We believe that the third country measures that the EU took against a refinery in Gujarat in last year was interesting, because we saw how that actually changed the behavior of economic actors in India. And I think our hypothesis is, without going into details, is that when you work against enablers of the shadow fleet, physical installations are often easier than virtual entities. So meaning ports, refineries, these kinds of things, because they can't be easily moved, whereas shipping management countries, for instance, can simply change their legal status and change their domicile, and all of a sudden they're sort of free from the sanctions. So enablers. So that's in the field of energy. In the field of trade, and this is not intuitive for any representative of Sweden to talk about restricting trade, because we are absolutely dependent for any kind of prosperity and welfare that we enjoy on international trade. We're one of the most open economies in the world, and we intend to remain that way. However, in the context of Russia's war of aggression, we believe we have to strangle Russian trade. Ideally, we wouldn't like to see any kind of trade between the EU and Russia. But looking at what we'd like to focus on in the 20th package is two sets of issues. The first one is fertilizers. It's the third biggest source of export revenue for the Russian Federation. We do understand that this is controversial in some EU member states, but we are firmly convinced that it can be done in a way which mitigates the effects for European agriculture. The second issue is metals. We made some progress there in 2025, not least on aluminium, but we believe much more should be done. And finally, just a quick word on circumvention. The EU has introduced something called the anti-circumvention tool. It's a legal possibility for the EU to target, let me see. So when we see in the statistics that country X all of a sudden surges its exports of a good to Russia, which they never exported to Russia before, it gives us legal opportunities to target that. The EU has actually never used this tool, which we believe is remarkable, and we believe it's wrong, and we believe we should start doing that much more aggressively. So that'll be our priorities for the next sanctions package.
So, Nicholas, a full maritime services ban, restricting trade, ideally no trade at all between the EU and Russia, but focused on targeting fertilizers, metals for now, and then improving the anti-circumvention tool. Where does Germany stand on this? And could you give us also a sense of European unity on these matters? You know, how likely is it to get some of these measures across?
Thank you very much for the question, Paulina, and good to have Vlad again on the line. We had the occasion to host him in Berlin the other week in order to talk on sanctions circumvention, all related aspects regarding the 20th sanctions package. We're still waiting for the draft legal text of the Commission to be put forward to member states, so we don't know what will be in it, but we had the occasion, I think, all member states to talk to the Commission ahead of the final draft of the first texts, which are to be circulated by either today or at the end of this week. We think time is of the essence here, so we want to have a 20th sanctions package ready for the 4th anniversary on the 24th of February, so we don't have much time less than 3 weeks roughly in order to get things done. And I can very much echo what Tobias just said. For us, thinking goes along similar lines. First of all, we need to speed up processes. Having introduced 19 sanctions packages is something, but still, I mean, if you look at trade figures, especially at the exemptions, some countries do have, looking at energy, especially gas and oil. This is something we have to really look at. Second thing is full maritime service ban. This is something we totally subscribe to. We think this is important. If you look at how the oil price cap worked, and I'm glad for Ben to have illustrated the mechanism, we think it worked. And given the fact that the Russian oil barrel is less expensive than, I think, Brent at the moment, we could easily go and introduce a full maritime service ban, which has, I think, much more significant consequences for ports, insurance companies, and so forth. So this would be something we would really like to see. On trade, yes, we have to look into the anti-circumvention tool of the European Union, because it's never been used, but one should use it carefully, because it has also significant consequences. But again, we're open to look into this. And the same goes for trade restrictions, looking at potash quotas, reducing or limiting them, fertilizers, and so forth. So I think Sweden and Germany very much look eye to eye. We have one exemption because we have one specific issue here in Germany, which is Rosneft Germany, because this is a subsidiary which is under trusteeship and which is responsible for providing energy to great parts of northeastern Germany, including western Poland. And so there again, we need to look for exemptions vis-à-vis the US introduced sanctions regarding Rosneft. But let's look at Tuluk oil sanctions in the European Union as well. So I think very similar views on what a 20 sanctions package should look like. But also important, I think, to bear in mind how far we have come so far. And if you look at the enormous costs Russia is bearing in order to circumvent the sanctions which have been introduced by G7 countries and the EU, estimates by the Commission go to up to 450 billion euros of forfeit costs, go up to 90 billion deficit for Russia in 2025 alone when looking at oil. Go up to more than 22% of reduced income in the energy sector. So there are a lot of numbers and figures out there which could be estimates, but look very solid because they've been put out by relevant institutions. So this is something we need to build upon also in our narrative. Sanctions do work. We need more of them. And I agree 100% with Tobias when saying, what is our strategy? Support Ukraine, put Russia under massive pressure, and of course keep the US engaged. And when putting Russia under pressure, we need not only more sanctions, sorry for bringing this up, but what we need is in times of a very difficult situation for citizens across Ukraine, looking at Vlad and Kiev and power cuts and massive Russian bombing of energy infrastructure. We need more air defense. This is as simple as that. And Germany is lobbying a lot for vis-à-vis partners. We have put out the immediate action on air defense initiative time ago, raising more than 1 billion euros for that. We are working on another attempt for our enduring action on air defense initiative together with the Ministry of Defense here in Germany in order to lobby partners ahead of the next Ramstein or Ukraine Defense Group contact meeting by mid-February in order to look into their arsenal and what's still possible. We're doing our part with more Patriot systems, more IRIS-T, and I'm glad that Sweden and other Nordic countries are major partners also in Pearl. Pearl Initiative, which is a very important aspect, buying US weaponry for in favor of Ukraine through a NATO mechanism. So let's not, when talking about sanctions, super important, let's not forget weapons, ammunition, and especially air defense in favor of Ukraine. Sorry for being long.
No, at all. You mentioned there, what is the strategy? And it's something that we also heard Natalia say earlier in reference to the shadow fleet, because so take a full maritime services ban, which Vladislav has also said is a priority area. You know, in my reporting at the moment, I'm trying to speak to captains of the shadow fleet who themselves don't understand what the policies are, and sometimes are hired onto ships that they don't even know, are they shadow fleet or are they not shadow fleet, and then realize what has happened. So what are the rules now? We're seeing a step up in Western enforcement. We're seeing, you know, ships boarded and intercepted. The other side of the coin of a ban like that is obviously enforcement. If a ship now sails into European territorial waters, what is the response? What is the action? Is there a coherent policy, or are these kind of ad hoc responses? Tobias, maybe with you.
I mean, you know, the first point to make is it's quite unusual for vessels belonging to the shadow fleet to venture into the territorial waters of EU member states, because that means that they will be under the jurisdiction of those member states. So that would be pretty much the same as showing up on land, and so it is quite unusual to start with. Now, looking at the question you raise. So what have we done? We've listed 600 plus vessels out of the shadow fleet. There are two things which are troubling us simply when it comes to the listing of shadow fleets. The first one is there's still needlessly low level of overlap between what the EU does, what the United Kingdom does, and what the United States was doing up until January of 2025. I think, yes, right. So that's something we need to do more about. The second thing we're doing is going after enablers much more aggressively and much more forcefully than we have done. Now, when it comes to enforcement, so on Swedish territorial waters, enforcement is the responsibility of those government agencies which are responsible, be it the customs service, be it the Coast Guard, etc., and they make their decisions independently based on applicable rules. And then finally, I think what we're seeing emerging, but it is tricky because this is sort of uncharted territory for a lot of us, but what we are seeing is an increasing cooperation between coastal states in the EU. So we have the Nordic Baltic states, we have the CBSS, the Council of Baltic Sea States, so that's the Nordics and Baltics plus Germany and Poland. We have the coastal states of the North Sea, and then in addition to that, we have close cooperation with the G7, with the European Union, and with NATO. And what we're doing is essentially that we're constantly trying to address some of these issues that you raised. But you know, I'd be making it sound better than it is if I said that there's some big grand strategy. We're kind of working on 100 different proposals and ideas in a piecemeal way, and everything has to apply, you know, to the conditions that apply in whatever country is doing this. So, you know, there aren't any silver bullets when it comes to enforcement. It's a constant work in progress that we're trying to improve as best we can. A final word on boardings, you know, we followed with great interest, not least what France did, first in the Atlantic with the Boracay, and then more recently in the Mediterranean with the vessel Grinch. You know, there is a very lively debate ongoing within our own system between the sort of the security people, the sort of the sanctions people, the Eastern Europe people on one hand, and the international law people on the other hand. And again, these are really, really difficult questions for us to deal with because, you know, the sort of the functioning of international law at sea UNCLOS is an absolute core interest, I think, for Sweden, I think for any European country. So this raises very difficult questions. We're having conversations with partners, with our French colleagues, with the UK to try to understand what were the sort of the legal reasonings that led them to certain things that they've been doing in recent months. And we don't have any conclusive answers from our end as to how that would apply in Sweden yet.
That's super interesting. Ladislav, let's bring you back in if you can hear us. You mentioned earlier also the anti-circumvention tool as well, and that you spoke about. Could you talk us through what Ukraine would like to see Europe do more of on enforcement?
Thank you so much. Hope you can hear me better now. Just a quick comment also on the shadow fleet. Well, I'm afraid that the allies are trying to play on the rules which the Russians are not obeying, and that's a massive problem. This is why this game is so difficult to win. So that would be really good to see if we can be speeding a little bit up some of the processes, because this is the only way, I guess, to outsmart the Russians, because otherwise they will be just keep sending the vessels with the oil, and we will be like looking at those occasionally, take some actions against some of them, but that's clearly not enough. So I really am hoping that some of the, let's say, policy developments will be taking place rather soon. I think that there are some positive signals from certain capitals suggesting us that there will be some changes of the policies, and which I say is also that we probably should not look at the, let's say, international law as such as something like constant or something. It's being developed, and that's normal for international law, and it has to be responsive for the challenges. Speaking of the anti-circumvention tool, well, too many people, I guess, especially present in that beautiful hall, I think that you've been seeing a lot of changes of the experts of selected goods from EU member states to selected countries, usually in Central Asia, but not just in Central Asia. And that is hardly explainable by changes on the markets of those countries. And everybody understands what is going on. And we could continue endlessly targeting like selected companies of those like neighbors. That's clearly not enough. I really admire a lot of diplomacy work which has been done by selected capitals and by David O'Sullivan, but that's been enough. I think that at this moment, this is a good time to send a clear signal that certain types of goods should be banned for exports to selected countries at home. That would send a strong signal, and hopefully most of the countries will make clear choice and will not tolerate anymore this type of proliferation of the items which we then be finding in the weapons. In 2025, the total number of the components imported to Russia was something about 2.2 million. That's a lot. And I think that some of the other measures should be taken to stop it, because otherwise they will be just continuing producing the hundreds of the missiles and vessels every month. And I mean, this night alone, that was 72, I believe, cruise and ballistic missiles used against Ukraine, plus 450 UAVs. And they've been also developing the technology which should also be very much kept in the minds. And that would be extremely wise at this moment to really reconsider some of the exporting rules on your side to see if some of the technology is being exported to the destinations, which might then be applied those for their own interest against the civilized world. By the way, one of the interesting developments about this night, it was Herbera UAV, which is like a small Shahid equipped with an FPV drone. So they are starting to use the, let's say, classic Shahid type UAVs as the carriers for the FPV drones. That's extremely dangerous. Not a big surprise. That is like conceptually understood for a while, but yeah, I mean, do you just imagine that another Shahids or Herberas fly into Poland or further, and then they will start disseminating FPVs. And one FPV can do a lot of harm, even destroy a whole tank, for instance. So that's been a challenge, and this is why I mean that probably more robust actions should be taken better now than later.
Thank you. That's a very frightening picture. Before we move on to questions very quickly from the audience, I just want to ask you, Nicholas, maybe to comment on that point. I mean, both of you represent, your directors also for Central Asia and the Caucasus. How much appetite is there in Europe to, I think David O'Sullivan is in Kyrgyzstan right now or this week, continuing that diplomacy, but how willing are you to move from diplomacy to much harder action, as Vladislav is describing?
Thank you for the question, and I think Vlad rightly pointed out that there is still room for improvement, or as Mrs. Ambassador put it, es ist noch Luft nach oben. One has to look at it, I think, in a 360-degree view that regards European companies that need to be addressed more specifically by governments here in Europe. That much more action is needed, I think, on the outreach versus key states enablers, if you might call them as such. You pointed out to David O'Sullivan, who's supposed to travel to Central Asia. I myself have been to Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan a few days ago. We will raise that issue with Central Asian states on the occasion of a 5+1 ministerial we'll be having on the 11th, or we'll be hosting here in Berlin on the 11th of February, when looking not only at components Vlad rightly pointed out to, but also looking at crypto platforms. That is also a point in case. We need to do more on China, being China, as was already mentioned, the main enabler in the field of common high priority goods in favor of Russia. And we have a specific tool for that. That's Annex 4 of the Regulation 883 from 2014, which gives us a complex mechanism, but which allows us to list third state persons, entities violating EU sanctions. But it allows, as a last resort, never been used, and I hardly doubt we'll come to that point, also third states. However, what's needed is to make clear to third countries that this war of aggression against Ukraine is a direct and existential threat to European security, and that's why we don't go lightly about what has just been described. And David O'Sullivan is doing an important job here. He's the Europe's voice in sanctions circumvention matters. And he has our full support. And again, problem is sanctions for the time being have to be decided by unanimity in the European Union. Germany would be in favor of qualified majority voting also in the field of the implementation of sanctions. There's a court case against the Council. It's been initiated by the European Parliament because the European Parliament would like to see QMV in the implementation of sanctions. and is against the current sanction schemes as we're using them. So it will be very interesting to see the outcome of this court case, because it might change the landscape also from how we implement sanctions. So again, a holistic view is needed. We have to address our companies. We have to talk to third states, but we have to do so in a very coordinated manner, and we have to be consistent and persisting, and in order to make life for Russia as hard as possible to source the items it needs. Again, the costs are already heavily, I think, or quite heavy for Russia in doing sanctions circumvention, but more needs to be done.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. If anyone would like to grill the panel on implementing sanctions and designing them, please. You have a microphone for you incoming. Up here.
Yes, thank you. Riccardo Giucci from Berlin Economics.
Thanks.
Julian showed very clearly that the problem, trade circumvention is a problem, but the bigger problem is imports from China. So China producing goods that used to be produced in the West, now are produced by China, and they are used for the war machinery. And Mr. Wagner, you mentioned that we have to be harder on China. But what can we do against China? What are the instruments for that? That's not clear to me. Maybe you can say a few words, and maybe, of course, to you.
Thank you for your question. I mean, I think we're constantly raising those issues also with the Chinese government. Foreign Minister Wadfu went to Beijing and, of course, talked about that. We have already listed Chinese companies, and through this instrument I mentioned, Annex 4 of the respective regulation. And it's not that those things don't do go unnoticed. I mean, this is something which kind of publicly shows that, as from a European point of view, companies of specific third states are doing sanctions circumvention. And again, we have already undertaken those kind of measures. We've also sanctioned dozens of Turkish entities. So we're doing already what we can do to the extent possible, but again, it's about unanimity within the European Union. And again, it's also about addressing, first of all, gathering the respective data, and then addressing governments, and do so in a coordinated way. So it's a process, and I can't reveal much more. It's simply that we kind of have the instruments at hand. We need to use them, and we see, of course, the cooperation of Chinese companies with the Russian market. Let's put it like this, as a matter of concern. And let's see what will come up with the next sanctions packages. Maybe just one brief word also on speed. We're still too much in the logic of packaging sanctions. That takes a lot of time. It takes weeks, takes at times also months. If you look at, I think, sanctions package which had been raised, it took us many weeks to get specific import bans in place. So maybe one should go more into the direction of continuous sanctions of individuals, of entities, without looking at the big sector thing, because that costs a lot of time and energy, and we don't have that.
Thank you. Tobias or Vladislav, would you like to add anything on?
Yeah, if I may, that would be, we have to be realistic. I mean, that some portion of the stuff will continue going from China to Russia, no matter what. So I think that overall this is a part of much bigger play in China and the other parts of the world. That's also true that a lot of Western companies been investing for a long time in China and building their manufacturer sites in the territory of China, which pays back not in a proper way, I believe. So I kind of, well, again, we should really continue pressure over China, targeting the enablers, keeping the diplomatic pressure, but we have just to be realistic that that is not to be resolved fully anytime soon. Maybe there are like some different angles on the problem, like tariffs, why not? Maybe some investment bans of any kind or implications on the general cooperation between China and the other countries or markets. So anything can help, but we have to think really strategically in a way, and we have to understand that some portion of the components will continue being available for the Russians. Maybe the West should respond with own production. Maybe that would be the answer.
Would you like to add anything, or should we move on to the next topic? I think we have time for one more question. If there's anyone who hasn't yet asked a question. Yeah, if you don't mind, because the lady in the middle here.
Yeah, thank you very much on the outputs. My name is Christa Maria Lebe. I'm with the German-Ukrainian Association and with Quantum Systems. And I have a specific question on the German companies, because we know that a lot of German companies, like not a lot, but several German companies' components have been found in Ukrainian weapons. I think even in the last days there was reports about a chip from a specific German company being found. And you mentioned you plan to talk to German companies, but maybe is there also a way to put more pressure on them, or what have you done maybe also in the past 4 years in regards to limiting or putting more pressure on our own industry to stop or be more responsible about their supply chains, not only where they source from, but also where they sell to? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't have a good answer to this one because we're foreign ministry. It's basically with the Ministry for Economic Affairs talking to the companies, but we know they do this kind of, they engage with them and try to bring down numbers in relevant fields, which are sensitive goods, which you can find also on the battlefield. But I don't have any statistics at hand, simply knowing that this is an ongoing process, and it's important. Maybe if I can use this opportunity to answer, or well, give a reply to what's been said by Moritz and from the very outset, criticizing German government for not doing enough when it comes to investing in military support or financial support in favor of Ukraine. Again, it's true. Es gibt immer Luft nach oben, but I think one needs to look at the absolute numbers here. So Germany, since 2022 and the start of the full-scale invasion by Russia, has invested more than 40 billion euros in military aid alone bilaterally, and more than 36 billion euros for like all the rest, which makes it, as the US has basically dropped out of financial and military aid in favor of Ukraine, the biggest donor, international donor at a bilateral level, and so I think it's important to see that we have already achieved something. If you also look at the absolute figures of the European Union as a convener of military aid in favor of Ukraine. But again, I'm with you that all of us, and I wouldn't single out Germany, all of us need to do more. And I don't want to go into the statistics, which are at hand of the Kiel Institute. And I think we know who you are thinking of when looking at big European member states being able maybe to do more. This is, of course, something which is an ongoing process. I mean, we've just pledged 11.5 billion euros for military aid for 2026 in times of recession here in Germany, with budget cuts of -8% across the board for all ministries. So that's a lot of money, but we're always able, or at least willing, to pledge for more vis-à-vis the German parliament, and in the past we managed to do so, to go that extra mile. Just sorry for this kind of publicity moment.
Thank you very much. So I think we need to wrap up there. And I just want to start by saying thank you to Vladislav, who has joined us despite the technical difficulties and everything else. So thank you. And thank you to our panelists and for the organizers as well. Thank you.